Rabbi Natan Lopez Cardozo was born in Holland and was ordained by the Rabbinic College of Gateshead, England. He presently lives in Yerushalayim, where he teaches at 3 schools, Neve Yerushalayim and Michlala, colleges for women, and the Or Sameach Yeshiva. His Pittsburgh visit is part of a 2-week lecture tour. His American lecture tour is sponsored by Neve Yerushalayim, a school where I learned with him. Some of you will be hearing Rabbi Cardozo for the first time this evening. I would like to share with you my response when I first heard him at Neve a few years ago. The lecture that he gave was on a topic which did not particularly interest me. However, the lecture was presented so clearly and proceeded so logically from point to point, in addition to being replete with fascinating information, that I became totally absorbed in it. After the lecture, I immediately began to change my schedule so that I could learn with him more hours each week. Because including more of Rabbi Cardozo's classes meant excluding some other classes, I discussed the idea with each of the teachers who was affected. One of the teachers made a comment which was reflective of the greatness of Neve teachers in general, and of Rabbi Cardozo in particular. She said, and I quote, "What you are learning in my class, you can learn anywhere in the world. There is only one Rabbi Cardozo, and he is here. You learn with him." She was right. There is only one Rabbi Cardozo, and Baruch Hashem, tonight he is here in Pittsburgh to speak to us. Rabbi Cardozo, my father and I are honored to be part of the chain of events which brought you to Pittsburgh this evening to share your knowledge with the Pittsburgh community. Bringing you here was our way of expressing our gratitude for you, for your contribution to my Torah growth. Rabbi Cardozo's topic this evening is, "For God's sake, whose land are we occupying?" Thank you. Rabbi Cardozo.
I would like to start this lecture telling you something about a man you have all heard about. A man who made a very great contribution to European civilization in the 18th century. A man who occupied big parts of the European world. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, the famous Napoleon, the emperor of the French Empire. As you know, he was indeed a very influential man. Did a lot of good things and made a lot of trouble. But one of the many good things this man brought about was that he created the possibility for the Jewish nation, for the Jewish people, to be emancipated, to be more part of the Western world. He took the Jew out of the ghettos, put him into the center of European culture, opened many universities for the Jewish community, and because of that very reason, Napoleon had a Jewish name. In the French world, he was called Napoleon Bonaparte. And the Jews used to call him Chelek Tov. Chelek Tov means a good part. And they expressed by that, and they translated that way, the French word Bonaparte. Bona means good, part means part. Chelek Tov. And no doubt the Jewish community by that wanted to express their gratitude to this man for what he did at the time to the Jewish people. But what you probably do not know is that Napoleon tried at his time to establish the state of Israel, what we today call the Medinat Yisrael, in his own days. And I tell you a little about this. Napoleon found himself in the year 1799 in Israel with the French army. That is, after he had captured Egypt, and he came to Yaffo, one of the today Israeli cities. And there he stayed for some time, and at that moment he sent a proclamation to all the Jewish communities throughout Europe with one request. And that request was, go home. I want you to go back to Israel, start your own states, your own governments. We, the French, will guarantee the success. We will make it possible for you to go where you are longing for, so for many thousands of years by now. And we will do everything in power to make this possible. The proclamation was officially sent from Jerusalem. We know that Napoleon never went to Jerusalem. But to make a good impression, there would not have been a better city to send it from than obviously from Jerusalem. And I just want to share with you one or two parts out of this proclamation because of its great beauty and of its very great importance for tonight's lecture, just to get a little bit of an insight into a world we know so little about. It reads like this: General Headquarters, Jerusalem, April 20th, 1799. Bonaparte, Commander-in-Chief of the armies of the French Republic in Africa and Asia. To the rightful heirs of Palestine, the Israelites. Israelites, unique nation, whom in thousands of years lust of conquest and tyranny and pain were able to deprive you of the ancestral lands only, but not of your name and national existence. Arise and be aware that attentive and impartial observers of the destinies of nations have understood clearly that the ransomed of the Lord, the Israelites, shall return with singing song into Zion, into Jerusalem, and enjoy undisturbed possession of their heritage and everlasting joy upon their heads. Rightful heirs of Palestine, this great nation, the French, does not trade in men and countries as did those who sold your ancestors onto the people. Arise, show that the once overwhelming might of your oppressors has not repressed you in every sense of the word. Hasten, now is the moment which may not return for thousands of years, to claim the restoration of your rights among the population of the universe, which have been shamefully withheld from you for thousands of years. Your political existence as a nation among the nations and the unlimited natural right to worship God in accordance with your religion, publicly and in likelihood forever. Napoleon Bonaparte. Very impressive. Impressive for many reasons, not only because of beauty, its poetry I would nearly say, but above all because this man, this Gentile, this non-Jew, seemed to have sensed something which most people in the world do not sense. That the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is a very unique one, a very special one, very different from any relationships which other nations have got with their countries. And I must say straight away and admit that it may very well be possible that Napoleon had other reasons why he wanted the Jews to return, which may have been political. But the fact states that this is one of the exceptions in history where a Gentile really went out of his way to try to establish the old new country for the Jewish people. He had insight in the psychology of the Jewish nation. He understood that the Jewish people is a little different than everybody else, and that even after nearly 2,000 years, it was possible to make them to return. For all sorts of political and other reasons, it never came about. The State of Israel, as we all know, was only established in 1948, a long time afterwards. And we shall not take time off now to explain you why it was not successful at the time. But the reason why I tell you about this is basically because one should be aware that there have been a few Gentiles, although no doubt it is a minority, who really tried very hard to get this established. Not only Napoleon was, let's call him, a Gentile Zionist of his days, but there were a few other people. Some you may have heard of, some you may not have heard of. There was a man by the name of John Toland, who was a disciple of the philosopher John Locke, who actually created a complete framework in the 19th century to start the State of Israel. There was a man by the name of Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper, who was the Earl of Shaftesbury in the 19th century in England, who drew up a detailed project to get this done. He pleaded, so it says in the documents, with the 5 main powers of the West to allow and enable the Jews to return to their land, seeing that everything seems ripe for their return. There was a Lord Byron, another famous man of history. There was a John Thomas, a William Blackstone, basically Christians. You may have heard about a lady by the name of George Eliot, Alexander Dumas, and a few more people, including obviously the famous Balfour Declaration many years afterwards, each one calling in its own way for the establishment of the State of Israel. Why do I tell you about this? Not just to remind you of the good days of the past. They were not so good. But to be honest, today we don't hear too much of this anymore. No great proclamations we come and hear coming from our Gentile friends. And if you would argue that perhaps there's no need anymore for all this, after all the State of Israel by now is a fact which nobody can deny, I would say that is true. But I wouldn't mind to hear sometimes another proclamation like that. Why? Because as we all quite well know, the State of Israel today is in great trouble. First of all, in the political sense of the word. The amount of attacks which are made on it in the media, television, radio, the papers, United Nations, I don't have to tell you all about, you know it. And many more people turn against us, now especially because of what happens on the West Bank, what is called the Intifada, Golan Heights, and many other places. But what is very important to understand, however unpleasant it may be, the fact is that we are not discussing today any longer the rights of the Jewish people to the West Bank, to the Gaza Strip, or for that reason, to the Golan Heights. Anybody who reads the minds of our enemies knows quite well there is much more at stake over here. We know quite well, and I say this with all respect, that the idea of many of our enemies is not just to take hold of the West Bank, but ultimately of the sum total of the land of Israel, including Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. And we better be aware of that. But you will not hear from me tonight, and I will stay very far away from it, making any political statement. I shall not discuss with you if I believe if we should, yes or not, give up some land, return it, as it is called, to the world around there. That's not me, and I'm not competent at all of making such a decision or a declaration. But I tell you why I mention this. I mention it for one good reason, and that is that today the problem of the State of Israel is not just a matter that we have to try to convince the Gentile world that we have something to say for ourselves by being in this land and holding on to this land, even when the whole world perhaps may stand up against us. But what worries me extremely is that more and more, and I can tell you I travel around the world a lot, and I meet many Jewish communities, I keep on hearing, and every time this voice becomes stronger, that the Jewish world starts to doubt our claim on this particular land. One gets so much influenced by what one hears on American television that the Jewish community is not sure anymore. And it starts sometimes to sympathize with the other side. And it makes declarations about the state of Israel which are perhaps very, very dangerous. That I have to worry about what the Gentile world says, true, but let's be honest, we have always had that problem. On the end, we had always to stand for ourselves, but at least we fought for our own principles. But if within our own community there are problems coming up of this kind, then we are definitely in difficulties. And it's to that matter that I would like to focus tonight. Basically what I want to do tonight, this is not a deep philosophical lecture, is giving you some ammunition, some knowledge of what we can use to defend our rights to this particular homeland without saying one word or one unpleasant word about the Palestinians, without making any political statement, but just putting some facts on the table, which it seems most people, most Jewish people by now have forgotten. And perhaps to be a little critical, many people who fight for the state of Israel, including some very important leaders of the state of Israel, seem to have forgotten. Now I must be very careful. From a religious perspective, as a rabbi, I could make it myself very easy. If somebody would ask me, from where do you know that the land of Israel belongs to the Jews? I don't have to tell you, I can quote an incredible amount of biblical statements of the Torah and of Tanakh, of the Bible, to make that point. Every second page of the Torah makes a point in favor of the Jewish people living in its homeland. The only trouble is that I won't get very far by doing that. Because if I want to give some kind of argument, I must understand that the vast majority of this world today is not at all prepared to accept a statement of the Torah as a real claim. I, as a religious Jew, I believe in the Torah. And to me it is an authority. But to the majority of these people, including the majority of the Jewish community, it is not an authority. It is not the last word. So I have to stay away from religious arguments. I have to stay away from biblical statements. It doesn't get us anywhere. But I would say like this, and I want you to hear this carefully, that after all this is being said, even when I cannot make use of real biblical statements as such, the arguments which we Jews can use to make a point in favor of our claim on this homeland is so tremendously great and so overpowering that I dare to say, without any exaggeration, there is no nation in the world who has so good claims for its homeland as we have got. If you are prepared, as you surely will, to admit that the Americans have a claim on America and the Canadians on Canada, over that region the French on France and England, then I would say, to use a Talmudical expression, kal vachomer, how many more so it is true when we start to speak about our homeland and our claim on this homeland. And one doesn't have to be a very great philosopher for that. One doesn't have to think very deep. It is just to know some facts about our very existence and about this very land. But to do that, I first have to introduce you to something else. The land of Israel is bound up with the people of Israel. And if you want to understand something about the land, you first have to understand something about the Jews. We're all Jews, but sometimes we are not aware how unique we are, how unusual our history has been. And only when we know something more about that, it may perhaps become possible to understand the whole political scene in which we live today and understand indeed the special relationship between us and this homeland. Let me make one or two observations. I would first of all say like this. The very existence of the Jewish people has become a very big problem for many nations of the world. You know why? Because we are around by now nearly 4,000 years. We are probably the oldest nation in the world. And if not, then we are one of the oldest ones, and definitely the only one in the world who first of all stick to its tradition for all these thousands of years. Living more or less the same kind of life. With our own culture, as people would call it, our own religion. But what is so important about this is that we were capable of doing that, while in fact the odds of history were totally against us. We survived, I would say, the total impossible. If there was any nation in the world, and I do not have to convince you of that, which was constantly destroyed, constantly attacked, which went to all the most terrible things which no other nation in the world ever went through, by any means and by any kind, then it is no doubt the Jewish people. We have lost millions and millions of people already before the Holocaust because we were Jews. And definitely we lost another 6 million, bad enough, in the Holocaust. To be clear, we, the Jewish people, survived 6 empires. The Egypt people, the Romans, the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Germans, and so on. We have become the victim of holocausts, of inquisitions, of pogroms, liquidations, without an end. Reading Jewish history is a great tragedy in many, many ways. And after all this has taken place, we are still around. And you know what that means? It means that that happens to annoy many people. Because many people say, what are these Jews doing over here? You know what they are doing? They are violating the laws of history. They keep on staying alive when they should have died out a long time ago. There was a very famous English professor, Arnold Toynbee he was called. He calls us a fossil people. We are fossils. We have no right to exist. You know why? Because indeed we did things which were not permitted. We stayed alive. Somebody once said, the Jewish people is an ever-dying people. But it never died. And that annoys the world. It is an exceptional situation. Can I just make a little picture for you? Imagine that you and I would have been there 2,000 years ago, living in the land of Israel. And Titus walked in. Titus was the general of the Roman Empire. He walked in with an incredible army. We probably never saw an army like that in the world. Making noise as no other army ever made. And they walked in and it took them 1 or 2 days to overtake the whole of Palestine, as it was called in these days. They nearly have no people to fight to. Jews were not used to fight too hard. They didn't know too much about it. There were people of a completely different dimension. And you would have stood there, and a professor, and a sociologist, an anthropologist would walk up to you, an historian, and he would say to you, tell me something. Do you see this Roman Empire? Incredible, what a power, what an energy. And you see these Jews, and you look around and says, well, yes, I definitely see the difference. He says, what is the difference? The difference is power indeed and strength in this Roman Empire. And these Jews, most of them have left hands. Most of them don't know how to fight. Most of them are not interested in that. On the end of the day, they're farmers. They go to a synagogue and they study some old scrolls, or old books. And this historian would say to us, tell me something. Who do you think will still be around in another 2,000 years? The Jews or the Romans? Now, if anybody of us would have suggested at the time that the Jews would still be around and there won't be a Roman left anymore, they probably would have told you that there's something wrong with you. But now that we are 2,000 years later and we look around, we see a most interesting thing. There is no Roman anymore around in the world. And the Jews are still there. Every time an historian got up and said after a Holocaust, an Inquisition, a pogrom, a liquidation, this is the end of the Jewish people. No chance to survive. and we stood at the graves and the tombstones of all our enemies. We outlived them all. And it is most embarrassing for the world. They don't know what to do with us. We do all sorts of things different. As you probably know, Mark Twain, one of your great people, once wrote an overquoted statement, but still very true. He asked the question, everything in this world is mortal, except the Jew. What is the secret of the Jew? But he didn't know the answer. And no historian seems to know the answer. They tried this way, they tried that way. And the only thing on the end is that it doesn't work. No rules apply, as if the whole of the Jewish people is beyond the normal. As if something very unusual happens. Or as indeed somebody once said, there are two histories in this world. There is the history of the nations, that's normal history. And there's the story and the history of the Jewish people, that's abnormal history. It does not make sense. And one must realize what an embarrassment that is, especially on the Western minds, the Western world, who wants to put everything into a place, who must understand everything. Everything must be usual and normal. And suddenly something totally unprecedented happened. It indeed annoys loads of people. And therefore anti-Semitism indeed came about also because of that reason. Although it is not the only reason. To accept something which cannot be explained, which embarrasses us, there's only one answer to that, one response to that. Do away with it. Liquidate it before it becomes an even greater embarrassment. But not only that. Do you know that we make up, throughout the whole of history, between 1 up till 4% of the whole of mankind? In according to statistics, some statistics, we are not even making up today anymore 1%. And what is so interesting, and which again is very difficult to understand, is the following. In according to statistics, the Jewish people should never have been heard of. They would have been some tribe somewhere in Africa. Nobody would have ever heard about these people. They're much too small for that. And you know what? History tells us an interesting story. There has never been a nation which has been heard about so much as the Jewish people. The Jewish people made an incredible contribution to Western civilization. We brought into this world monotheism. We brought into this world morality. Let's be sad here as well. We brought even into this world Christianity. We brought into this world the Muslim. And I always claim only a Jewish boy could have been a false Messiah. What is there so unusual about these Jews? Why did they indeed contribute out of total proportion to the amount of people we have always existed of? We paid a price for that, an enormous price. But historians and also very great people have been asking, and are still asking till this very day, how does that work? It again does not make sense. And if that is not good enough, you can quite well understand what happened in 1948. 3 years after the Holocaust. That is, 3 years after the greatest liquidation the Jew ever went through. 6 million people, 2 million children. When the whole world got up and said one thing, this is the end of the Jewish people. There is no future. This is impossible. No nation can ever survive anything like that. And 3 years later, the state of Israel came into existence. Again, totally unprecedented. Completely coming out of nowhere land. Nobody ever anticipating anything like that. All historians being upset. Toynbee, the man as I just quoted before, became even one of the greatest opponents to the state of Israel. Why? He said, because you can't allow a nation to go back 2,000 years later to its homeland. If we must permit anything like that, we must also allow all the other nations to go back to their homeland. Yes, we would say that's true, but there are no other nations who are capable of doing anything like that. They don't even are as old as that. Very strange, very unusual. And also, we all of us have a lot of critique on the state of Israel, including myself, and I disagree with a lot of things which happen over there. what happened in the last 40 years in the state of Israel, with all its mistakes, takes any other country and any other nation 400 years, 300 years to make the same mistakes. So I'm telling you one thing. This whole thing is totally, indeed, unprecedented. It presents a breakthrough. It has destroyed conventional conceptions, ordinary expectations, and the world just does not know what to do with all this. And therefore, they put a lot of time in us. They come with their media, they come with their journalists, more than there were ever in Vietnam and many other places, and they speak about these Jews. And obviously, and I shall not go into this now, if the Jew makes a mistake, if an Israeli soldier makes a mistake, he's after all also human, then we blow it up out of all proportion. Why? Because we feel a little guilty about this Holocaust. But if, as some indeed papers tell us, the Israelis today are creating a Holocaust in the West Bank, which is totally untrue by all measurements and by all standards, and a real lie, the reason why they do that is because then afterwards they can sleep a little better. They don't feel so bad about what they permitted in 1940-45 when they allowed the Holocaust to take place on the Jewish people. If the Jews are as bad as everybody else, then we don't have to worry so much. But the Jews are not as bad, with all the mistakes which they happen to make. But in any way, what we have to ask tonight is one very important question. How was it possible for the Jewish people, indeed, to create something of a power, of a spirit, which kept the Jewish land alive for 2,000 years? No other nation ever did anything like that. Any nation which walked out on its homeland forgot about it after a few hundred years, assimilated, found themselves another place, another home. And the Jewish people as such never did anything like that. True, many Jews assimilated. Many Jews see themselves purely as part of another nation. But if I speak about the Jewish people had one focus, Israel, nothing else. That is what they've been speaking about the last 2,000 years. That is what they have been fighting for in their mind and later with their hands. And we must straight away ask the question, how did they do that? How did they keep something alive which was never kept alive with any other nation? What is the meaning behind that? How was it possible? Well, again, many people have come up with different kind of answers and responses. Nostalgia, a very strong feeling for the homeland, history. Yes, I can bring up many different arguments, but you know what? Not one works. They're not good enough. Because they're all true about all the other nations as well. Having love for one's native soil, that's true about all nations. But they still broke down after a few hundred years. And the strange thing about the Jewish people is that by being away for 2,000 years, they start to become even more in love with the Jewish land. In 1948, it just bursted. They couldn't do anything else. What is the reason for this? I think I have the answer in all humility. The answer is not new. You probably know about it, but it's an unusual answer. And that shows straight away the great difference between us and any other nation in the world in relationship to our homeland. When nations of the world speak about their homeland and their claims on the homeland, they make one point, and that is, we have a right in this land. You know why? We were there before, our grandparents were there, so we still have a right to be there. I would say a very unusual thing. We Jews have no right at all in our homeland. We don't argue like that at all. We argue from a completely different perspective. We say the following. We say it is not a right by which we try to build this land and return to our homeland, but it is a duty. And we have a word for that in Hebrew, which you all know about. When we speak about duties, Jewish duties, we speak about a mitzvah. And what we mean by the word mitzvah is what we believe to be a divine commandment, an instruction. What I'm saying is this, and I'm not using here a religious argument as such. I'm not quoting here the Bible. What I'm saying is this. We Jews have been believing And from a secular perspective, we may say it's not even true. But one thing is true. We have been believing it. That a long time ago, 3,500 years ago, there was a man by the name of Abraham, of Abraham. And this man was called by God. And God said to this man, and according to that tradition, you know what? I want you to go to this homeland. And you should know I am not speaking about rights. I'm telling you it is a duty to go to this homeland. It is an imperative, a divine imperative. If the secular community comes and says to me, yeah, but that's a religious argument, I say, no, that's not true. You know why? Because we are not discussing if it is really true that God spoke 3,500 years ago to this Avram. What I'm saying is that the Jews have been believing this for the last 3,500 years. And that nobody can deny. And that created a certain power within the Jewish people. And a constant reminding themselves of one thing, you know what? It is a duty to live in this homeland. And that somewhere kept this land alive. Because the Jewish tradition kept this concept alive. Because Jews kept only alive because of the Jewish tradition. So automatically they kept alive their notion, their relationship with this homeland, because it was considered to be a great divine imperative. God once said to Abraham, Lech lecha, go to this land, and I want your children to live there for all the years, for all the thousands of years to come. That is a totally different story, even from a secular perspective, from any other country, any other nation. Nobody can say that God once said anything like that in the same way as we make that particular claim. But let us understand a few things. In the year 70, nearly 2,000 years ago, the Jewish state was destroyed by a man called Titus, we spoke about before, the Roman general. And it was only again being introduced into history in the year 1948. Nearly 2,000 years in between. And let us be clear about one thing. In all these 2,000 years, it never, and I want you to hear it as well, became an independent state. For all these 2,000 years. It never became a political society. All the time, when other nations found itself there, they used it, they looked onto it as occupied territory to be ruled from without. The Turkish never saw in it their homeland. The English didn't do anything like that. The Crusaders didn't see it like that. And to be exact, if you want to know, altogether 14 times this land has been conquered and reconquered by all sorts of nations coming and going. A hotspot of nations coming and going. And nobody ever said anything about a state. Nobody ever said anything about an independent state. Including, and I should be aware of that, the people who today call themselves the Palestinians. And we now today hear about the Palestinian state, one should be aware of one thing. The idea of a Palestinian state came into existence after the state of Israel was established, and definitely not beforehand. No nation ever saw a need, never wanted to declare it into its homeland. Only the Jew, till the days called 70 years after the Common Era, and again with 1948. Now another point which we must take into account. We Jews never left this homeland. If anything is true, as we all know, we were thrown out of this land in the year 70 by this man called Titus. We are forced out. But we made one important point which many people seem to overlook. And it is this: when we were thrown out, we are forced out of it, then we made it very clear to anybody till this very day that this was still our homeland. You know, we had one word for anybody walking in. You know what word that was? No. That was the word. We don't at all ever permit you to go and see yourself as the new inhabitants of this land. We rejected their claims. We objected against their occupations. We never ceased to assert our rights, our title to this land. And this is a very important thing. You know why?
Let me quote you a Talmudical statement, which is also applicable to any secular situation. It makes a lot of sense. The rule in the Talmud is like this. If an object is taken by violence, but the owner does not abandon the hope of regaining it, no one ever has any claim to the object except the original owner. If you lose something and you don't give up on regaining it, it stays yours. When you give up hope and you say, forget about it, then you've lost it. And that is the great point here, which everybody must understand, at least every Jew must understand. We, the Jewish people, never cease to assert our right to this land. Under no conditions. We kept on saying for everybody, as we shall see in a moment, no, no, no. You know what? The moment that Titus threw us out, we already were thinking how we were going to return there. We never found another homeland. Wasn't true of this. It is true that our protests, our no's throughout history, were not heard in the public squares. They were not heard in the old United Nations. You know why? Because we were not allowed to speak. Because they cut off our tongue before we were capable of saying anything at all. But if you look inside, in the ghettos, and wherever the Jews have found itself, then you know about one thing. And that is that we have constantly been claiming and restating our relationship with this land. And I'm going to give you some examples just to get an idea how forceful that argument is. Every Jewish prayer, I would say, is pregnant with the land of Israel. The prayers were emotional cries for the last 2,000 years to go back where we actually mentally never left. We mourned this land, but we never cried it away. The more it died, the more it came alive. Till an overwhelming fire in 1948 just could not allow anything else but to return there. How many times have we Jews not asked ourselves one question? Where do we live? Where are we living? And I have a very great surprise for you. And that is this. We have never lived in Spain. We never lived in Portugal, in Poland, or in any other particular place. And I dare to say we have never lived in the United States either. I tell you what is true. We may have stayed in these countries, but we never inhabited these countries. We never settled there as a nation. Man does not live where his body may reside, but where his soul is dwelling. And the Jewish soul was dwelling only in one place, Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael. We better take this into account. I dare to say the following. You know when the state of Israel was reestablished? Not in 1948, but in the year 71. The moment that Titus threw us out, the Jew was already thinking, how am I going to reestablish the state? How am I going to rebuild it? And how did he do that? If he couldn't do it with his hands, he used it through his tradition, by studying the Torah, by keeping the land, as we shall see in a moment, alive in all conditions, in all possibilities. Our prayers, I would say, were our building blocks. Our commandments was the cement. And our Torah was the shovel by which we brought this about. For thousands of years, we Jews have been praying, and to be exact, 3 times a day. Not 3 times a week, not 3 times a year, not 3 times a month, but 3 times a day, in the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening. We have been saying to God, may you rebuild Yerushalayim in your mercifulness. Take pity, O Lord, our God, on Israel and Jerusalem, your city on Mount Zion, the habitation of your glory. May it be your will, O God, to make us to return back. For 2,000 years, the Jews have stated this at least 3 times. This is totally unprecedented. There was never a nation in the world which ever did anything like that. A nation left may have prayed for 100 years and forgot about it. And we did that 3 times a day. Merciful Father, deal kindly with Zion and rebuild for us Jerusalem. This is enormous. This is deeply impressive. There is no nation which is claiming today the land of Israel or for that reason any nation concerning its own homeland, making and capable of making a claim that it's been praying for 2,000 years after it left its homeland. The international community today tells us that perhaps Jerusalem should be internationalized. There's a man in Rome, the Pope, who tells us that that is what we should do. And then sometimes even people in America make these kind of statements. And I ask you one question in all objectivity. Is there anything to discuss? To whom Jerusalem belongs? Does it really make sense to make this a matter of concern or better a matter of debate? Let me tell you a few things. To whom does Jerusalem indeed belong? Does it belong to the descendants of Rome? To the Christian church? To the Arab countries? Well, let me remind you of one thing you also know. I know one thing, and you know as well, that for all the last 2,000 years, when people, Jews, Christians, Arabs, atheists, when they spoke about Jerusalem, they had one other name for it. Everybody used that. Even in the New Testament and the Quran, the Bible of the Arabs, you will find it. You know what? They called Jerusalem the city of David. The city of David. And you know what? David was a Jewish man. I do not remember that anybody ever called it the city of Titus. I do not remember that anybody ever called it the city of Gottfried of Bouillon, one of the crusaders. And I neither remember that it was ever called by anybody, including the Arab world, that it was called the city of Saladin. It was called by everybody after a Jew, because everybody understood quite well that that was exactly the truth about it. And if that is not good enough, let me ask you still another question. Did the descendants of Rome, of Titus, of Gottfried, of Saladin, do they fast on the day of the destruction of Jerusalem for the last 2,000 years? We Jews, as we all know, we sit on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, in the middle of the summer, on the floor, crying. God forbid anything would happen to any of the American cities. Would they still sit down 2,000 years later and crying for that city? Only we Jews did that. Not the people of Titus, not the Romans, not the people of Egypt, nobody else. No Arab, only the Jewish people. Perhaps you have heard about a very great Israeli author who was called Shmuel Aknon, who is no longer alive today. Was a religious man who received the Nobel Prize for Literature many years ago. And I remember quite clearly that I watched on television when he received this prize from the King of Sweden. The greatest prize a person can ever receive. And there this man stood, a religious Jew, with a big black yarmulke on his head. And when the King of Sweden came up to him, before he said anything, first of all, Aknon made a bracha. He made a blessing in front of all the cameras. Because we Jews make a blessing when we see a non-Jewish king. Especially if he's good for the Jews. So he made a bracha and explained to the king what he did. Very impressive. But I'll tell you a little incident, which I never forget. After that, the king came up to him and he said to Mr. Aknon like this, in English. He said to him, Mr. Aknon, tell me something. Where have you been born? Where were you born? And Aknon said exactly the following words. He said, I was born in Buxax. Buxax is a place in Eastern Europe. I was born in Buxax. But that was in a dream. In reality, I was born in Jerusalem and exiled by Titus. That's what he said to the king. And you know what? That is exactly what Jews have been saying for all the thousands of years. To all the emperors and all the kings and all the people who came on top of us. We said, by accident we are born outside Jerusalem. Really we are born in that place. Our whole life, our whole soul, our whole personality belongs there. That's an impressive statement to make in front of the Gentile world. In a matter of a moment, you capture the whole of Jewish history and a relationship between us and that specific homeland. Nation in the world can make a claim like that. Am I not right when I say that we have got better things to say for ourselves than many other nations? Not good enough? We go on. When a child gets born in the Jewish community, and there's a circumcision, a brit milah, what do we say at the time to the child? Many of you don't remember anymore, but I tell you what they said to you. They said at the time to you the following words: may you be worthy to ascend to Jerusalem on the 3 festivals, on Pesach, on Shavuot, and on Sukkot. You know what they did? These 4,000 of hours for the last 2,000 years, they made us, when we were 8 days old, into Zionists from the very beginning. The first thing what we ever say to our baby is, be a Zionist. Think about going back to Israel. That's the place where we should be. And the child grows up, and he can stutter a few words. What kind of words have we been teaching for the last 2,000 years to our children? The songs of the street? No. We taught them the songs of King David, the Mizmorim, the Tehillim, the Psalms of King David, when King David made songs about Jerusalem and about Israel. That's the first things what children have been saying for the last 2,000 years when they opened their mouths up for the first time in history. The Jewish song about the land. Very impressive if we think about it. The child grows up, and one day he marries, and he stands under the chuppah. What do we do for the last 2,000 years, as we all remember, when we stand under the chuppah? In the middle, on the end of the ceremony, we take a glass. We put it on the floor, and we break it. And why do we break it? Because we say one thing: shall we forget about Jerusalem even on this greatest day in my life when I get married? For 2,000 years they have been doing that. Do you know how many glasses got broken? And the person continues. The Chatan, the bridegroom, takes the bride home. What kind of home? What is there? First of all, there is always a mizrach somewhere hanging. But the second point is, as you know, in every Jewish home, there was a part of the wall which was not plastered. A piece was left out where you could see the stones. Why? How can I live in a beautiful place for the last 2,000 years if Jerusalem has not been rebuilt yet? Impossible. And according to Jewish law, a Jewish woman should not walk around with all her jewelry at the same time. Why? Because Jerusalem has not been rebuilt. When we have a festive meal, we leave one candle out. We don't light it. Because Jerusalem has not been rebuilt. Every opportunity for the last 2,000 years to remind us where we belong, where we want to go to, has been infested in us. No nation anywhere in the world can have something of that, can have a transition like that, or for that reason a claim one. And when on the end of his days, after 120 years, as we say, a Jew dies, where do we bury a Jew? I have again a very unusual comment to make, and that is this. All Jews for the last 2,000 years were buried in Israel. And if you say to me, that's not true, they were born in New York and every other place, I deny it. I tell you why. I would say the following. All of us were born, or better, all of us one day will be buried in Jerusalem and in Israel. How? If we can't bring the man or the woman to Jerusalem and to Israel, we will bring Israel to him or to her. Because what have we been doing for the last 2,000 years? We may indeed find ourselves in a foreign country, but we take the scent of Israel and we sprinkle it over his body, over her body, and only then we close the cover. He is going to be buried in the land of Israel. His tombstone may stand in Chutzlaretz, outside Israel, but his body is right in the land of Israel. What an incredible thing if you think about it. We've been doing that for 2,000 years. No nation in the world did anything like that. And what do we say to the mourners who sit on the floor for 7 days, who sit Shiva as we call it? What do we say before we walk out on them? What do we wish them? May you be comforted between all those who mourn for Zion and Jerusalem. And what is the last word which anybody ever said after he gave a drasha? May the Redeemer come to Jerusalem. I never heard anybody saying, in all respect, may the Redeemer come to New York or Frankfurt. So I ask you once more, is it not very impressive what happens over here? Who can take this away from us? It is true, it is an unusual argument which we normally in the political field we don't use. But as we shall see in a moment, it cannot be denied and it will have to be taken into account. in the final analysis, the problem which we are discussing over here is actually very well stated by the greatest Jewish commentator on the Torah, our famous Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki. We've all heard about him. Have a look in your Torah one day. Look to the first statement which Rashi makes at the very beginning of the Chumash of the Bible. Rashi says there is like this. He says, why is there written, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Rashi asked the famous question in the name of the Midrash, of our tradition. Why did the Torah not start much later in history? Only when a Jew came about. That's a long time afterwards. Or when the first mitzvah, the first commandment was given. The first imperative was given. Says Rashi, a most strange thing which I never understood. He says, you know why? And I quote, because if the nations of the world say to the Jewish people, you are robbers, you're ganovim, as we say in Hebrew, you have stolen this land, then the Jew can reply, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. All the earth is the Lord's, and he gave this land to the people of Israel. What was Rashi trying to say over here? I never understood this. Because what I couldn't understand is this, that Rashi really believed that the argument worked. If somebody would stand to the United Nations, as I said before, and everybody is against the state of Israel, everybody says that we've stolen land, and that is exactly what happens at this very moment, then we would get up and say, Rabotai, we are very sorry, all of you over there. You forgot a Russian. Will they listen to us? Will they say, oh yes, we forgot the first Russian. We better change the whole political scene in the world? What is Rashi trying to say over here? I never understood this. Till I found a statement made by a secular scholar, which reminded me, we say in Hebrew, lahavdil, of this Rashi. A man, well, there would never be a more secular person than that. An atheist, a man who was very influential in Europe, who died only, I think, 2-3 years ago, the greatest French philosopher of our age, the greatest existentialist of our time. You may have heard his name, Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre was once asked, many years ago, when the state of Israel was established, how he saw this, what he thought about this, about the Arab-Israeli problems. And he wrote a little pamphlet, and he said a few very interesting things there. And I read you exactly, literally what he wrote. He said like this, and this is very impressive. I cannot judge the Jewish people by the accepted rules of history. The Jewish people is something beyond time and place. And we cannot pass judgment on the dilemma of the Israel-Arab relations without taking this into account. What was Jean-Paul Sartre saying? He said the Jew is an exceptional nation. He's beyond time and beyond place. He has done the most abnormal things. He stayed alive and he returned back home. He influenced the world beyond end. But he did it. And I, as a secular atheistic thinker, said Sartre one thing. I can't deny that. That are the facts of life. And you can't walk away from the facts of life. So I have only one point to make, he said. If this is the case, then we cannot judge the Jewish people and the state of Israel by the same standards by which we judge any other nation or any other state. Because the reality opposes this. And then I suddenly said to myself, I've heard this before. But I heard it before in a religious framework. I would say again, lahavdil, as we say, that this is what Rashi said. Rashi made basically one observation. He said like this, if the Jewish people are a normal people, and they have normal history, perhaps there is something to say 2,000 years later that you are robbers. But the facts are that Jewish history is abnormal. The facts are that Jewish history is unique, that the Jewish people are around, that they have done all these great things. If that is the case, then it means somewhere that not only different standards are at work, but to say by Rashi's statement, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz. Here is a nation which reminds us of God. Well, if you indeed understand that, then obviously the standards are different. What Rashi said, in a religious sense of the word, Sartre said in completely secular terms. Indeed, there is something to say for it. We have a claim. After all what I just said before, it stays a unique situation which cannot be denied, not even by the secular community. And Sartre understood that better than many other people in the world. Let me, before I finish, make one more statement here. A few months ago, in an American paper, and I do not even know which paper it is because I got only part of the copy, where a non-Jew, as far as I know was a non-Jew, wrote a few very interesting insights about the political scene in Israel and the Middle East. And it starts like this. When I look at the world map, I sometimes wonder what the insane fuss in the Middle East is all about. And he says, you know why? Because if I look on a map of the world, if I look on a map of the Middle East, you know what? I can't find Israel. And you know why? It is so small that you can't see it. You need magnifying glasses. Only then you see it. And he says, you want to know how small it is? He says, to give you an idea how small that is, you could take about 40 Israels and put them together, and the whole thing would still be smaller than the state of Texas. 40 times you get the whole state of Israel into one state of yours called Texas. And in fact, he continues to say that he knows about the fact that there are people who in Texas own more land privately than the whole state of Israel. What are we speaking about? A piece of real estate where a few Jews want to live. With an incredible Arab world around it, who doesn't know what to do about this little piece of land which you can't find on the map. He continues, consider the population. 4.5 million people are living in Israel, by now probably 5. There are many cities that have more people in their cities. New York is much bigger. So are London, Istanbul, Bombay, Tokyo. They have much greater populations. You could put 3 times the population of Israel in Mexico City. And Chicago, if you include the suburbs, is almost twice as great as big. So we are talking, as he calls it, about a mere speck on the map. People sometimes refer, he continues, to Japan as being small. But it's almost 20 times as big as Israel, with 30 times as many people. Syria, 9 times as big, with 3 times as many people. Iraq, 20 times as big, with 17 million people. Iran, 80 times as big, 80 times as big, with almost 50 million people. Put that part of the world together, and there are millions of square miles with a population bigger than that of the United States. So indeed, what are we speaking about? And he asked the obvious question. A whole Arab world with an incredible might, with hundreds of millions of people over there all together, and they don't even manage to get us from the map. We are there, and we stay there, as we all quite well know. And we only ask one thing to all these people. We ask you for only a 50th of the state of Texas. Just let us live there. We've had so much trouble for the last few thousand years. Can't you give us this? There is so much space over there where everybody can live with comfort, including the people of the Palestinians, who we wish them only well. We don't want to make any trouble for them. But no, they must have that little piece of real estate. It is difficult for many people to grasp this or to want to grasp it. But to say indeed, like this man ends his article in the paper, he says, in a funny sense of the word, he says, it makes no sense. I mean, and I quote, Israel does not even have one really good golf course. That's what we are speaking about. So what is there to discuss? What is there to say about all this? Except that we better know our arguments. that we know that we stand for something which is not only very valuable to us, but perhaps as Winston Churchill once said, if the Jew goes and returns back to his homeland, then he will do even greater things for the welfare of mankind. If he feels at home, he will probably come up all sorts of great things, if they just would leave us in peace. That we don't have to put our mind on war. We don't have to put our mind on defending. By that time, the inventions which probably will come from the land of Israel will indeed overtake the world and will be tremendously beneficial to the world. That's what we stand for. And we as Jews better know about this. In fact, there's one thing which we must here add to all this. And this is a serious matter. And we cannot, let's say, deny that or just forget about it. What made this possible? How was it possible that we hold on to this land? How was it possible that we kept alive for all these thousands of years? How is it possible that we made so many contributions? Why is it that we are such a unique nation? Let us be aware of one thing. It was not just Jewish nationalism, and it is neither secular Zionism. It is only one thing which brought this about, and that is Judaism proved to be indestructible after all these years. It is the Jewish tradition who made this possible. It was the Torah who made it possible. And we must be aware of one thing. If we want this state to succeed, then it must become a real Jewish state. It must be a state where the highest levels of Jewish ethics, or what we call halakha, Jewish law, whatever name you want to give it, is installed and inspires everybody, so that on the end we will inspire the whole of the world. We are a world-embracing nation. We are a world-transforming nation. That's our task in this world. We go out and we teach the world something of tremendous importance for their own good. And the base from where we do that is this little piece of real estate, so that we can serve the rest of mankind. Let me therefore finish by a statement made by a great man called Yaakov Herzog, who was the brother of Chaim Herzog, who today is the president of the State of Israel. This man was a rabbi, like his father was. And he was the ambassador for Israel to Canada for many years. And in one of his many very famous papers, he wrote the following words. Zionist propaganda, he writes, and the Jewish agency with all its powers and influence, nor even the State of Israel, with all its ambassadors, institutions, and a supreme effort, encompassing the whole Jewry and all its economic resources, could have achieved 10% of what 1 hour of prayer at the Western Wall did for the Jewish people. To stand at the Kotel HaMaravi, at the Western Wall, and to pray has done more to the Jewish people, has more builded the Jewish people than anything else. Not that all these other things are not important, but they're only byproducts of Jewish tradition and of this, what this Western Wall basically stands for. So I have only one basic message, and that is, if there is anything to say for a land, for a country, for a nation, then we are the best of. We are the most privileged. And we have just to go out to the world and first of all make our fellow Jews aware of this, before they make this disastrous mistake, which creates a lot of pain and harm by going to the other side. We want the Jewish state to become more Jewish. We want to do with all the political problems over there, which are a headache for us, which undermine the economics, and many other things. It's all true. But on the end, there is something to work for, to fight for, here in Israel, wherever you find yourself. And therefore I finish, like every Jewish person finished on the end of any statement he made. And it is this. May the Redeemer soon come to Zion and Jerusalem. Thank you.
Any questions?
Absolutely.
Perfect.